Welcome to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. I'm your host, Eric Bjornstead, your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. If you haven't joined us before, the Fuel Pulse Show is for anyone who uses fuel or who has things that use fuel, and that means whether at home or at work. And that means it is pretty much for everyone, especially anyone who has a job who manages fuel storage tanks or distribution systems where that fuel needs to be taken care of because they needed to get the job done, whatever that job happens to be. So if any of that sounds like you, then the Fuel Pulse Show podcast is for you. So what are we going to be talking about today? Well, today we have an opportunity to talk with Jeff Hove, the Vice President of the Fuels Institute, which is a nonprofit that evaluates market issues related to vehicles and the energy, i.e. fuels, that powers them. So the Fuels Institute is a group led by a diverse board of transportation experts, and it serves really as a collaborative research organization. And very importantly, it does not advocate, which means the Fuels Institute doesn't get paid by anyone to take sides on a particular issue, which means what they have to say matters, a great deal. Jeff himself has over 20 years of experience in the fuels and the transportation industry, and his work primarily focuses on areas of industry and government regulation as they relate to things like reducing carbon emissions, while also at the same time improving business metrics and profitability. And Jeff has designed and implemented numerous software solutions in the past, which have all been aimed to allow industry to meet compliance demands with a view towards kind of helping to achieve legislative and regulatory goals. So that's a lot to unpack in all of that. I'm really looking forward to getting into some of these things. So, Jeff, welcome to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast.
Eric, it's a pleasure to be here, and wow, way to get through that whole history of Jeff Hove. That was beautiful. I'm glad to be here.
Well, it took I practiced at least a couple times to get through that, but yeah, definitely we appreciate having you on. So, I guess we want to start somewhere. Let's start by talking about the group that you're involved with. So, many people out there, they don't know what the Fuels Institute is. They don't know how its work impacts what they do, in their line of work, why it matters to them. So can you speak a little bit about the Fields Institute and how would you describe the good things that the Institute does to people who may not know that much about these kind of things?
Yeah, I've been with the Fields Institute now for a couple of years. I had worked on projects with them since probably about 2013, 2014. So it's been around for a while. I think where Fuels Institute was born out of was, this is a very technical and lots of ups and downs in this industry, a lot of knowns and unknowns, and industry kind of came together to say, look, we really need something that is an unbiased view, something that we can really gauge the direction of our organizations upon, not necessarily opinions that have some type of political skew to them or some other type of goal or agenda. And so it's been this really fantastic and real effort to kind of get out of our silos of thinking. Our board members
Yeah.
come and sit on our board, and they talk openly, and they don't talk about necessarily what is the best thing for their company. They talk about what is the future of transportation and what is the future of fuels. And then we look at what are those hurdles, what are those roadblocks, and then they start to see what those paths forward are going to be in the future. And that's kind of the goal. What direction are we going, without kidding ourselves, right? Without just working in those silos, talking at each other, working across industry lines, and and hearing what other groups have to say and learning from that. And so it's been a great experience. I love working with the Fuels Institute. I'm very research centric, data centric, way of thinking, and our peer review process that all of our research goes through is extremely thorough. Um, and nothing leaves or is available to the public, which is all available, by the way, for free.
Mm-hmm.
But as nothing is available to the public without going through a very rigorous, uh, peer review process by all of our board members, our board of advisors, our task groups. Very thorough.
Yeah, and I think that people, in the time that we live in, if you want to put it that way, people are so used to coming across people or groups that have an agenda. They have interests that they're trying to protect, and so it colors the the advice or the information that those people give. And I think we've seen so much of that that the average person is at least a little bit skeptical when they come across a group, whether it's the Fuels Institute or somebody else, and there's a topic that, maybe it's a controversial topic, maybe it's something that intersects with something that is politically hot, like, environmentalism or something, and different people chime in, and the general public, they're used to all those people uh, chiming in with an agenda. And so it's refreshing that you have a group with the weight that the Fuels Institute has that ties so many experts and big players in the industry together. And they don't have an agenda. They're really trying to be unbiased. Like I said, they're not paid by anyone in particular, so they're not beholden to anyone. And that, I think, engenders a pretty high level of trust. If someone's not trying to push an agenda, you're a lot more likely to be able to trust that what they're saying is actually closer to the truth than somebody else that does have an agenda.
Yeah, yeah. It's a very real concern out there. And to your point, in this day and age, it's a huge concern. What can you believe and what can you not? What should you kind of take with a grain of salt? Um, but I will say that we cover our board, our the input that we get spans all of transportation, whether it's a fuel refiner,
Mhm.
a fuel retailer, a wholesaler. We have biofuel producers. We have electric vehicle manufacturers. We have engine manufacturers. All throughout, and we also work with utilities. To make sure that we're covering all the ground because transportation is being redefined. Transportation fuel is being redefined.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. And so, yeah, so you've got this mix of a bunch of different kinds of really worthwhile people or entities, I should say, on your board. And so you've got big retailers like Walmart. You've got major engine and equipment manufacturers like Cummins. Um, what most likely do they get, or what benefit do they most see from being associated with a group like the Fuels Institute? I mean, if they're going to spend time and resources to be involved with such a group, then why are they doing that?
That's the $1 million question. That's a great question, and I will say that they do spend a lot of time and a lot of resources with the Fuels Institute. And I think it gets back to that trying to trying to look at what the future has in store for them, and having a more or a less opaque crystal ball, if you will, and you can only get there by communicating and by listening to other people that are in the industry. Or for example, um, just because you're Walmart doesn't mean you are the best company in blending biofuels, for example. Or maybe they are. I just made that up, but I think everybody recognizes in the room that they do not have all the answers, and the only way they're going to get more answers is if we come together and have these conversations. And And when we can't come up with the answers, we put together a scope of work, um, and we put out a request for proposal on large
Mhm.
research projects, and we have the experts, the researchers go out and do that research to answer those questions. So I
So
think
really,
that,
it's
you know,
yeah, it's real. I mean, Walmart's big expertise, let's say, is in logistics. So Walmart's really good at that. Cummins is really good at making engines, but they also recognize that, like you said, they're not experts in everything, and they need to be associated with the people who are experts so that they can continue to lead in their own fields. Everything's kind of interconnected, I guess, is how I would see it.
yeah, very much. I mean, it's the supply chain, right? I mean, we talk about this. We talk about the disruption of the supply chain here recently, and it's
Hmm.
a big issue. Couple that with the changing policies and the changing push on climate change, and where we're going with that, and how everybody in the supply chain now has to lean on whoever it is you're associated with. So in other words, Walmart needs to ask its fleet third-party carriers and fleet
Hmm.
operators what they're doing in this space for carbon reduction or whatever. And now they
Hmm.
got to share that information. So we have all the right people at the table. We just got to make sure we're asking the right questions. And those questions come from our board. They're the ones who bring up the topics. They say, you know what, this is what's keeping me up at night. What can we do about this? What direction is this going, or you know, how do I skin this cat?
Hmm.
And it's a lot easier to answer those questions when everybody's at the table.
Yeah, yeah, I can very much see for a group like Walmart, it's really in their best interests to be able to hear, like you said, the people who are, let's say, the electric vehicle builders saying these are the questions that keep us up at night as we're trying to advance this sector of the industry, because Walmart knows, for example, that electric vehicles are going to become a bigger and bigger part of how they get their business done, and so they need to have as a seat as close to the people who are actually developing those as possible, so that Walmart or Cummins or Amazon or whoever else is on the board, they can make the best decisions possible at the right time.
Correct. Yeah. Absolutely. And at the right time is a key part, right? What is the rate of adoption? What is the rate of change?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not so much. So there's the question is, are we going to have change? What
Mm-hmm.
direction is it going to go? And then at what rate will it go? And to always try to stay ahead of that curve, which becomes it's increasingly more difficult to stay ahead of that curve and not go
Mm-hmm.
down a rabbit hole, which is another thing you can do if you're a big business, if you're a company and you go down a rabbit hole. Now you just expended a lot of resources and capital
Yes.
to go in the wrong direction. So it's really important that we try to get our hands around this, and we don't we also reach out and we work with the Department of Energy, the Department of Transportation, EPA, um,
Mm-hmm.
and other agencies too. So as we're talking about policy, and if they've got questions for industry, they know that they can come to us and say, okay, are we going down the right path? So it's really everybody working together, which is unusual. you know.
Well, and the fact that, again, you're not an advocacy group, so you don't get paid by anyone to give a particular line. They know that they can trust what you're going to tell them.
I, I really hope so. I mean, we try very hard, right? We're not infallible, but I think the way we have the Fuels Institute established and our protocols are such that no one thought or opinion, can trump everybody else, right? I
Hmm.
mean, that's the nature of peer review, and so we try very hard, understanding we're human, and sometimes it's hard to put your strong opinions aside. So you create that environment where you can keep that in check, and then that's a big part of the Fuels Institute process.
Okay, so let's talk about the process that you're referencing. So you've referenced several times this idea of peer review. Now, coming from the science area, we understand what peer reviewed journal articles are. Relative to what you do, can you tell me a little bit about the process where the process that the Fuels Institute undertakes, where peer review would be a key element of that?
Absolutely. So again, our boards and our task groups are very involved in developing the scope of work. It could be
Mhm.
any scope of work. One of our
So, what
most
would be an
recent ones.
example of a scope of work, like an
Yeah,
example that somebody
yeah.
could?
One really cool one we did recently was a comparison of life cycle analysis of
Hmm.
greenhouse gases of the internal combustion engine, your standard
Yep.
gasoline light duty vehicle, versus an
Hmm.
electric vehicle.
Oh,
And
okay.
so
Yeah.
and so, you hear a lot about, some people will say, well, an electric vehicle is actually dirtier than a gasoline engine in some
Okay.
cases. And what's going on there? Because you've got mining operations, you've got rare earth
Hmm.
minerals, you've got battery production. So that's what the life cycle is. It's really
Everything
from,
that goes into it, they're
yeah,
making this case because they're saying that in order to mine the rare earth metals that have go into that, you have to expend a lot of resources, and so they end up saying, well, no, they're not really better for the environment. Or yeah, okay.
right,
So people
right.
people say that.
Yep. And then on the flip side, it's our fuel. Where's our fuel come from? Well, we've
Hmm.
got the oil fields, we got transportation of crude, we got refinement, we got transportation of refined product, and then of course the ultimate combustion in the engine, which is the big source of CO2
Yep.
from that side
Hmm.
of the fence. And so the question was, what's true? What is true? Let's stick a
Yeah.
fork in this so we can understand it and then move on. We can't keep debating this minutia,
Hmm.
and if it's going to slow down progress. So let's just figure it out once and for all, and then we'll move forward. So we put together the scope, we do the research, um, and and it was done very, very well. Ricardo was the researcher that did this
Hmm.
particular project. We choose, we've got multiple research groups, global research groups that will come in and do this work. And then, once the draft final is completed, this then goes through this peer review process, which it goes to our board of advisors. Our board of
Hmm.
advisors, everyone has an opportunity to chime in. You can see everybody's comments, within the application that we use for our review process.
Hmm.
Uh, and and if somebody takes issue with something particular, then we have a whole nother process that says, well, okay, if you think this is if you think you're right and we have to either remove something or add something, we have to put that up to the board. And then the board, it needs a certain amount of votes to actually get that change or that modification done. So
Hmm.
it's pretty rigorous. And I will say we've had board members leave because we came up with results in the past, and
Oh.
they didn't
Hmm.
necessarily like our results, and they asked us to change them, and we said, no, no, that's not how the program works. And
So.
so so then, so we do that about 2 or 3 times. We'll send it back to the researchers because sometimes there'd be it could be typos, it could be using
Hmm.
the wrong units or something,
Yeah.
um, that we're, and each time we go through another peer review. So it goes through at least 2 peer review processes, and then once we get the final approval by our board of directors, we put the final stamp on it and we push it out. So that's the gist of our peer review process. We've got about, I would say, anywhere from uh, probably right around 80 different companies and their staff that are all looking at this document, and making sure that we're crossing our T's and dotting our I's.
So, so you were undertaking this question of comparing the life cycles, so to speak, of internal combustion engines versus electric vehicle engines. So, are you in a position to talk about what your findings were?
Sure, sure. Yeah, absolutely. More often than not. So of course the big and we also, by the way, in this process, we looked at the inclusion of biofuels as
Yeah.
well in the mix of the petro.
Hmm.
And so that was included in here. So the electric vehicle is less detrimental or is going to emit less CO2 and GHG emissions, greenhouse gas
Hmm.
emissions, over its lifespan. And that's virtually across the board. Now, when you get into really heavy coal states, Virginia, West
Yep.
Virginia, um, the electric vehicle will never be as clean as a light duty gasoline engine over its lifespan. Um, so I say that cautiously, right? Because we know that the grid is getting greener. We're seeing
Yeah.
more solar, more wind, et cetera. And so we're seeing some relatively easy improvements on greening the grid. Um,
Which may
and
change the
and I will
equation
say,
in the future.
oh, definitely, yeah, almost. I mean, you could really do this study every 6 months and
Hmm.
see that change. I mean, that's how quickly we're seeing renewables enter into our electric grid. Um, the wet gallon fuels a little bit more difficult. We can do
Hmm.
so much for improved engine efficiencies,
Hmm.
or reduced carbon in the actual fuels that are going into the vehicles, and that's a life cycle type look
Hmm.
at it. From farm field all the way to blending biodiesel, and burning it. So, I mean that's really what came out of this report, and I would encourage anybody to look at it. It's again, it's on our website. You do have to you're registered to download it, but the report is
Hmm.
free.
Yep.
And there's a couple of others out there. This is not the last time this study will be done, but you can really see the trend going. Some of the changes that are foreseeable are the impacts of battery production through
Yeah.
second life and recycling of the battery itself, and battery chemistry, right? I mean, eventually we're going to be constantly improving the battery chemistry, and hopefully having being less reliant on the cobalt or the lithium, some of the more weak links in that chain. But there's some smart
So
people out
there's
there
some
that
good work that's being done in that area. Um, and so based on your, shall we say, insider view, knowing what you know about what the players are doing, you're saying that even the batteries that we have right now, when people raise objections, whether they're good faith or bad faith objections, because we know there's plenty of bad faith objections that are raised in the in the social media battleground of people arguing about green energy policy and whatever. There's plenty of bad faith arguments that are offered, where where they will talk about the costs of the batteries, and well, not the financial costs, although that is raised, but the a detriment to the environment for producing these batteries. And so what you're saying is that there's some good work that's being done to try and even improve in that area.
absolutely. And then of course the social cost, right? Every once in a while you hear about, oh, there's children out there barefoot in mines,
Yes.
being used as slave labor. And so a lot of what we've been doing kind of falls under the environmental and social governance planning, the
Yeah.
ESG planning. And in that
ESG. Okay.
we've got the S for the social. What are our company's social impacts? So everybody's looking really closely at their supply chain impacts. So whether or not, if they are producing a biofuel through, part of the process is to take down so many acres of rainforest just to
Mm-hmm.
plant crop so that you can grow more biofuel crop. We're all becoming much more sensitive to that. Some of these negative impacts that we're having. So whether it's on a population, which are very real issues, or deforestation.
Hmm.
For every action there is a reaction, and we
Yep.
need to be conscientious of all those things. And the only way you do that is by hearing what's being talked about out there, and then either just bringing it to light. Right? We all like to talk in the shadows. We all like to sit down in the cafe and talk to our buddies about our opinions and stuff. But you know what does that mean? What does that really mean?
Yeah, yeah, and especially when you talk about something like, yeah, electric vehicles. I think that the average person doesn't know a whole lot about everything that goes into them. They don't know a whole lot about how the technology is changing. All they know is maybe they read in the newspaper that the President Biden wants to have this many. They hear very broad policy strokes, and then depending on which side of the political aisle they're on, they either like it or they don't like it. Um, and I've talked to people about the electric vehicle issue, and I myself, I'm an optimist. So my view on this idea that the country wants to move towards a more wide scale implementation of electric vehicles is that whatever problems that currently are limiting that, whether it's battery capacity, how far you can drive a standard light duty vehicle on a battery charge, the amount of time it takes to charge, the availability of charging stations. My optimistic viewpoint is that whatever problems there are with that, they will solve those because they always do. And I myself can envision a point in the future, let's say 20 years from now, when my son graduates from college, where they're going to look back on all the things that were said today by people who are less optimistic about electric vehicles, and they're going to probably say, I wonder what all the fuss was about. People talking about like availability of charging stations. Um, you know, there's a gas station on every corner. So 20 years from now, why wouldn't there be charging stations in every parking lot? So for me, I take a very optimistic view of the fact that yeah, there's hurdles to be overcome, but they'll fix them because they always do.
I think that's true. I think that there is we've got a wealth of knowledge that's coming out, and there are things that we know are incredible improvements, and they're available today. It's just simply that they're not economical. It might cost too much to make that improvement,
Hmm.
or uh, you know we could talk about electrolysis on hydrogen fuel cell vehicles,
Yeah, yeah.
and the cost thereof, and it makes it so that it's not price competitive. But as we
Right
start
now.
looking through the lens of, yeah, right, as 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 climate change impacts begin to occur more frequently,
Hmm.
that price tag is going to become more reasonable, or there's going to be,
Yeah.
to your point, new technology that's going to bring that price point down. I mean, I think your
Hmm.
your example on batteries is fantastic. What we went from $1,000 per kilowatt down to, what are we at
Hmm.
today, $130 per kilowatt
Yeah.
in a short period of time. I mean, nobody expected to have that level of drop off on the price of batteries so quickly.
Hmm.
But I will say though that, I mean, I agree. Electrification on the passenger vehicles is going to be the future, and maybe some minds or some psyches have to change, as far as, well, what if I want to drive across country? Can I
Yeah.
do it? Well, okay, how are you going to, you got to plan some more or whatever. But 80% of charging, 75 to 80% of charging can be done at home,
Hmm.
for our daily
Yeah.
use. And and there's a lot of these little things that the public's going to have to learn. Now, there's segments of the transportation industry that will never go electric. It's going
Yeah.
to be
Talk
so
about that.
difficult to electrify. Yeah, I mean, Class 8 trucks going coast to coast,
Okay, and
with
for
large
the
payloads.
less
It's
savvy
going to be,
people, what's a Class A truck?
that's just your 18 wheeler,
Okay.
your big trucks. So class of trucks typically go from class 3 to class 8 by size
Okay.
and weight.
Yep.
Um, so your large trucks going across country, or driving in excess of 600 miles or so a day, it's going to be
Mm-hmm.
really difficult to just the sheer weight of that battery is so massive. And then of course to charge it, you're talking about stops that have gigawatt level charging infrastructure,
Yeah.
which is very
Mm-hmm.
hard to install and come by. But now, if you've got a scenario, we call it the hub and spoke scenario, right? Where you're near a port or
Mm-hmm.
you're near a warehouse and you know your
Mm-hmm.
fleet is only going, you come back to the hub every night to charge, and then you're making your deliveries, your short deliveries during the day.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's a scenario where you could electrify. Um, but others, we're going to have to look more hard at hydrogen fuel cell. We're going to have to look at, what improvements can we make with our straight diesel fuel and biofuels. And, I mean, there's just some things that are going to be very difficult to electrify. I know we're making some progress in small planes,
Mm-hmm.
and ferries, waterborne, but big ships and some of the other things that are out there, which we don't really get into at the Fuels Institute. We really stick
Yeah.
with on-road transportation, but we get asked to look at a lot of those things as well. But yeah, there's no silver bullet, as much as the politicians want you to believe that there's a silver bullet here, or it's a good you know speech piece.
Yeah.
um, we have to look at massive decarbonization today in every manner possible, because what we keep out of the atmosphere today is just something that much less we have
Mm-hmm.
to worry about later on. So if it takes 10 or 20 years, 20 or 30 years to build out this electric vehicle scenario and
Mm-hmm.
ignore everything else until then, well, we just shot ourselves in the foot,
Yeah.
right? You can't put all your eggs in one basket, cross your fingers, and hope that in 20 or 30 years everything's going to be
Yeah.
electric, and that
Yeah. Yeah.
our grid is unicorns and rainbows. But we've got real solutions right now that I think policymakers and other folks have to implement.
Well, and the other thing that strikes me about these kind of situations, which are or these kind of problems, they're what I might term big sciencey problems. They're not easily solved. They require a lot of people doing work in a lot of different areas in order to get us to where we need to go. And I think that the the thing that strikes me about this um, is that uh, at some point, government has to be the one that jump starts the investment. And what I mean by that, I remember I read a great book by Michael Lewis called The Fifth Risk, which was talking about all the different things that government does. And one of the things he talks about was the government's role in how much it invests in different areas. And he brought up, or the people that he talked to brought up the government programs like ARPA-E and I believe DARPA, if I'm quoting that correctly, and talking about how a number of the scientific advancements or technological advancements that we have that we use on wide scales today were really only made possible because the government invested early in the process before private entities were willing to jump in and get involved. Basically, private entities are not going to get involved until they are at least reasonably sure that they're going to be able to recoup their investment. So, when it comes to this whole electric vehicle thing, whenever the government proposes to invest money and people raise their hands and say, we don't want the government doing that, I'm sitting back thinking, like, well, the government has to do that, and you should expect the government to do that because, Elon Musk isn't going to jump in at the very beginning because it's not developed yet. So to me, there's an appropriate that this is one of those places where it's very appropriate for the government to get involved in investing in the things that are going to make sure that this progresses towards the place where we want it to be. And if the government doesn't do that, then we may not get there because it's an essential part of the process.
Yeah, I think, one of the other role that government plays is, well, you're right. They're taking on risk. They're taking on risk that a for-profit organization would probably never do.
Mhm.
And but that doesn't mean that they can go out there with some shotgun approach and waste away taxpayer dollars, right?
No,
They
no.
need to have this well thought. That's, the Department of Energy spends a lot of time, looking at these types of programs.
Mhm.
Um, and then, which ones are shovel ready? Which ones are is the is that model really foreseeable, and that, we can have users on it, and it can be ready for industry in a short period of time. So, yeah, I mean, it's extremely important, that we have those dollars, and our electric vehicle charging infrastructure is probably, one of those big opportunities where
Mhm.
Biden came in and he said we're going to have 500,000,
Yeah.
new charging stations across the country. Our
Yep.
which is really just a beginning, right? The report that we
Mhm.
did on what would be actually necessary for the U.S. fleet would be about somewhere between 1.3 and 1.8 million charging stations, um, and but again, there's still a lot of questions on what's actually needed. But so that's where the National Electric Vehicle funding, the NEVI funding, is coming up with, right? We're
Mhm.
we're in talks right now with the DOE on uh, and the new joint office on how do we spend this $5 billion that's been earmarked just for this
Mhm.
$5 billion, um, to get this built out as quickly as possible, as intelligently as possible, right? Because it's one thing to throw money at something, and if it turns out all to be
Mhm.
garbage, now you've just shot yourself in the foot.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. One thing you said that I didn't get a chance a few minutes ago to circle back on, but just to kind of put a bow on it, when you were talking about the 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 life cycles of the engines, and you said that, or you at least implied that uh, the answer is dependent on where you are in the country, and you said that if you're in a coal heavy state, that petroleum powered internal combustion engines would come out ahead. So how does that work? I guess what is it about being in a coal fired state, or unless I'm flipping it, but basically, how does where you live meaningfully impact the answer that you got when you were looking at it?
yeah, so when you open up that report, you start to see some of the charts that show how, the variables for that we
Mm-hmm.
studied for the electric vehicle, and then of course the variables that we studied for the internal combustion engine. Um, and when we're in an area, so the drivers on electric vehicle, uh,
Mm-hmm.
the emissions are mostly in the manufacturing of that vehicle. That includes the mining,
Yeah.
and the production of the vehicle. Um, and then because there's zero tailpipe emissions, right?
Yep.
It goes down the road, and there is no direct immediate emissions. Those
Right.
emissions come from the electricity from a power plant that's
Mm-hmm.
miles away. Um, and depending on how green it is, I mean, how much renewable content they have in that production will determine the overall life cycle and uh, carbon intensity of that
Mm-hmm.
vehicle over, let's say, 200,000 miles of
Sure.
usability. Um, yeah.
Okay.
So if you are in a region that's being served by um, heavy coal power plants, then you have to
Mm-hmm.
you have to take that into account in your life cycle analysis for that. So we looked at different regions
Okay.
across the country.
Okay. Now, another thing I know that the Fuels Institute has looked at is this kind of this broad category of fuel quality, um, and I know that the Fuels Institute did a fuel quality study. Um, can you talk a little bit about what that study was about and how the results matter to the average fuels manager out there who might be listening?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think so we were this topic came up from a couple different angles, right? And
Hmm.
we there's one, the issues that were being reported on corrosion of equipment.
Okay.
And by equipment, I mean the underground storage tank of the fuel retailer, and the equipment used to dispense the diesel fuel.
Okay.
But the one that we probably focused more on when we did our fuel sampling was more on what is the performance implications, or the detriments, on the engine itself, if it's a poor fuel quality. And what is the fuel that we're selling out there today. We got, so on one hand we were getting reports of corrosion from the fuel retailer, and then on the other
Hmm.
hand we were getting reports coming back from OEMs, engine manufacturers, saying that we have warranty issues coming in. Our engines are coming in because our injectors are fouled out.
Yeah. Hmm.
And that was the big driver. If you remember, they're all going to this high rail injection pressure
Yep.
system, PSI, crazy,
Yep. Yep.
pounds per square inch.
30,000, 40,000.
And yeah, and so obviously that means that if there's a lot of things in that fuel that could foul that out. It could be particulates, it could be
Hmm.
dissolved metals,
Okay.
it could be water or bacteria,
Hmm.
microbes. There's a lot of things. So, how clean is our fuel across the country is what we're really looking at. And so at the same time we were doing that, a group called the CRC was
Hmm.
doing an in-lab test. So
Yep.
our sampling was being done. We were pulling samples from underground storage tanks, and above ground storage tanks, and doing lab tests. That the CRC study was really focused on corrosion, and it was strictly
Okay.
um, a predetermined environment type thing where they watched what the fuel quality was, and
Yep.
everything. Ours was really a kind of a random selection across the country on pulling samples. And our diesel fuel quality council at the time decided, okay, this is what's important. This is what we need to look at as far as testing. And some of those tests aren't even covered by the ASTM
Sure.
specifications, which is D975. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and and so we had to kind of go outside of ASTM to look at other test methods. So
Well, they're all ASTM
so
tests,
we
though.
we
Just
kind of ran the gamut.
I
Um,
I was going to say
y-
that
well,
they're all
I mean, I
ASTM
think,
tests, but they may
yeah,
not be on D975.
I think you're right. They're just not included as a requirement under D97.
Right, like oxidative
Right.
stability is one
So,
that gets
so we
referenced a
we
lot.
we we ran all of our tests, and yeah, yeah. I mean, depending on where you're at in the world, oxidation stability has a different requirement. Is it 8 hours? Is it
Hmm.
3 hours? Is it 20 hours? Et cetera.
Yeah.
And so, we compared a lot of those to see how we compared with other countries too.
All right. And then, so what were there any
And
key
so what?
takeaways?
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, what were the big takeaways that you were able to get from this study?
I, what we found was what we thought we would find. I mean, well, what we talk about
Hmm.
all the time. As far as what is the driving issue here, and we saw, of course, water in the fuel has always been an issue. If you can keep the
Absolutely.
water out of your fuel, you can limit your corrosion, you can limit your microbial activity,
Hmm.
um, and your microbial activity might be adding to the dissolved metals in the fuel.
Sure.
And so, really, I mean, it all drives back to water almost every time. Um,
Okay.
and but we also saw some things that were pretty interesting, like what size fuel filter do you use on your dispenser? So how are you treating that
Oh.
fuel before it gets to the engine, before it gets to the vehicle's tank? And
Oh.
do you use a 30 micron filter or a 10 micron filter? We looked at what was different about those test results before the filter and after the filter. And one thing that jumped out at me was that regardless of the size of the filter, we still saw dissolved metals getting through, to the engine. And I
Hmm.
thought that was pretty interesting. So even a 10 micron filter was letting, we were still seeing dissolved metals get through. And so, of course, the big issue there is, are the metals impacting not just injectors, but after treatment systems of these
Hmm. Oh
large
yeah.
vehicles, right?
SCR catalysts,
And
things like that.
yeah, yeah. I mean, you mean the damage, could be significant. So through that, one of the takeaways I got was that our test methods are probably sorely lacking as far as, well, one, there is no metals testing in D975. That's a problem.
No.
But even when you do test for metals, the equipment that's being used in the lab, the 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 threshold levels are probably too high. We need to get better equipment to actually test that fuel. But it's honestly, fuel quality will be an ongoing, and we'll
Hmm.
be doing studies on this forever, as long as the internal combustion engine is on the road, and we're
Yeah.
trying to make an engine better and better and more efficient. Um, so so yeah, I thought it was a really good study, um, and we've got there's some other nuances in there. What was the impact of ethanol? Were we seeing cross contamination? Ethanol getting into our diesel fuel because of how we're maybe
That's something that
transporting
people
the
have
fuel.
raised, like switch load contamination and how that influences microbial activity.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we did see, and then the CRC study as well. Saw impacts of ethanol and some microbial activity. So you kind of catch me off guard here. I shouldn't speak too much on that, but I mean, I would encourage people to look up and check
Hmm.
out the CRC study as well
Okay.
on that. I will say that almost every time, though, you could dial it back to water in the fuel, whether that's
Hmm.
dissolved phase water or free phase
Yep.
water. You know that's they're both are important.
Yeah, it's
I don't
interesting
know
to
if
hear
that's a
you
bird
talk
on
about.
my side or if it's on your side. I think I hear
No,
a bird.
that's on your side. All our birds in Florida are probably hiding because from the heat. Um, I was saying it's interesting to hear that one of the things that you looked at was the dissolved metals issue, and of course talking about it going through filters, I would expect that to happen if it's a dissolved metal. But then you talked about how there's a possible issue of how it influences the emissions control systems, whether it negatively impacts catalysts, anything like that. And of course, anytime you bring up those, you're talking about a broader uh, issue, if you will, of emissions reductions, reducing greenhouse gases, things like that. And I know that broader subject area is something that the Fuels Institute has, really looked at closely in a number of ways. So, um, I guess my question would be, is there anything that the Fields Institute has done that would be interesting to people, um, and relevant to them as far as the things that that the Fields Institute has found that the average person should pay attention to?
We do get into the weeds quite a bit, and I kind of see our job is taking, highly technical reports and
Mhm.
data and making it readable for the consumer, for Joe Public. There's a tremendous amount of information out there from the national labs, Argonne, NREL, Oak Ridge,
Yep.
and there is fantastic material. Sometimes it's just really hard to digest and to
Yeah.
understand. So whether we're talking about fuel efficiency or carbon reduction or greenhouse gases, it's really easy for people to read a couple sentences into it and go, well, that's it, that's boring, or, it's just attention spans today are so quick.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
I would so I'm hoping that that is part of what we're trying to do here, and it's not just with the public, right? It's with policymakers as well. They want that quick blurb, they want that quick,
Hmm.
few words to say on something, and and you really just kind of cross your fingers and you hope, boy, I hope they're not making policy based upon what they just said, because they probably they may not understand what it is they're talking about. So we're trying to make sure that our research also gets into their hands as well, so that they can make good policy, and policy that that will improve our atmosphere and
Hmm.
not kill our businesses. Right? I mean, it's this balancing act. We have to be really careful, because what good are you doing if in the process of all of this we're destroying companies? And that
Well,
sounds a little
and
bit
that's
harsh, I
important, I
realize,
think.
but I mean, yeah,
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 that's a very important thing for people to realize, I think, because of the polarization of our country. um, Both sides, it doesn't matter which side you're on, both sides have they think they know what they know about the other side. And when we're talking about environmental issues, which tend to get associated with, the left on this hand, um, I think that it's important for people to realize that, um, you do want to not fix the environment, but you want to make things more environmentally friendly, because we want to preserve the planet that we live on, right? We want to preserve the environment for our later lives, for our children, for our children's children. But at the same time, what you just said is also very important, that we want to do that without destroying businesses. And I think that it's important for people to realize that there are groups like the Fuels Institute or any other, parallel groups who are really trying to find and communicate this kind of information, so that we can do something about the environment while also not bankrupting our economy, not bankrupting businesses, because you need those too. And it's an unfortunate sign of our times, I think, where people want to go all or nothing in either direction, and not realize that the real truth of the matter, and what most people do favor is being somewhere in the middle and having both, trying to do both things.
Yeah, yeah. I do think we're at, the situation is dire. I mean, we do, we can't drag our feet any longer. We know change has to occur. It's just, how do we do that in the best possible manner so that the least amount of people are hurt in the process? I mean, hopefully nobody's hurt in the process, but
Oh, yep.
there will be winners and there will be losers. Um, and but if good sound policy and even industry steps. I mean, there are organizations that are doing much more than what's being called for by the U.S. federal government. Um, but I mean, how do we do this in a well balanced manner, expeditiously? I
Mm-hmm.
would say expeditiously, and we need to be going kind of full throttle. Um, but it's kind of hard to pay attention and see when you're going so fast, you know.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's this is all really important stuff, I think, for people to pay attention to, because like you just said, we are, I don't know if we're at the edge of the cliff, but we're getting incrementally closer to that, and we're getting close to the point where real substantive things have to be done. It's gonna there, like I said, there are going to be winners and losers. Um, we just want to find how to minimize the pain uh, for the losers and to minimize the costs for the winners, if I could put it that way. And I think it's really important to have groups like the Fields Institute who are doing that in as much of an unbiased way as possible. I think if more people knew the work that you all were doing, I think that they would be really pleased.
yeah, I like to think of it as those people that their businesses are going to be severely impacted. Take this time. You got an opportunity to evaluate. You got this opportunity to pivot, um,
Mm-hmm.
and or it's business as usual, and you accept your fate.
Yep.
I guess I don't know what else. I would not know what else to say.
Well,
But the train's coming down the tracks.
yeah, yeah. Well, Jeff, where can people find out more information about what you and the Fuels Institute are doing? Maybe access some of these reports. Where can people find you if they want to know more about what you have done and what you are doing?
Certainly, certainly. You can go to the research tab on our page, which is fuelsinstitute.org,
Okay.
.org, and all of our information is on there. I will say we are in the process of reorganizing our webpage, like a lot of people are. It seems like these days.
Yeah.
But all of our research is paid for by the companies that are members of the Fuels Institute. They want to know the answers, and so with that, they make it available for everybody to download. And if you want to get more involved, I would encourage you, if you are in this field of transportation industry, um, I would encourage you to reach out, pick up the phone, give me a call, and we can talk more about what it is the Fuels Institute does, our purpose and our mission. And
Hmm.
um, we'd love to have as many companies, and the more diverse, the better,
Right.
in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
reach out.
Diversity's good because you want to hear as many different perspectives from all the different types of people and entities that are impacted by this. So definitely
Yeah.
can see that. Um, well, Jeff, it has been a real pleasure talking with you. You've certainly said a lot of things that should get people thinking. So thank you so much for joining us and sharing this expertise and this perspective that you have with us and our listening and viewing audience. We really appreciate it. Hopefully, we can have you back on at a later date to talk some more about some of these things, because I think all the things that we talked about, you could spend hours talking about any one of them because they're so complex, but yet they're also so important, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I appreciate the you having me on, Eric, and yeah, hopefully in the future we can dive in. I mean, if you get some feedback on this, I mean, we can explore other paths and
Yep.
dive even deeper. I'm
Perfect.
game.
Well, again, thank you again for joining us. And so that about wraps things up for today's episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. Thank you so much for spending part of your day or night with us. Check out the show notes at our website for links to everything that I've mentioned in this episode. There's certainly a lot of resources from the Institute that we can link to. Show notes are located at www.bellperformance.com. Please make sure to subscribe to this podcast in iTunes or Stitcher, wherever you happen to get your preferred podcast from. Last but certainly not least, if you liked what you heard, please leave us a review of this podcast at your preferred site, as it is one of the primary ways to help people find us. So till next time, bye-bye everyone. Catch you next time at the Fuel Pulse Show podcast.